What's up everybody, Dillon with an I here, and today I actually wanted to go ahead and try to contrast my old list of the most influential games. So this list is going to be the most catastrophic games of all time. But first, if you guys are liking the content, please leave a like if you like the video. Subscribe if you want to see more, it really helps out the channel and I'd really appreciate it. And make sure to leave a comment letting me know what you think the most catastrophic consoles on this list are going to be. We're talking the worst of the worst. Destroyed company reputation, stopped them from making consoles ever, and made babies cry over how awful these consoles were. And no, the Dreamcast isn't on this list, so if you thought it was, you can go somewhere else with that mess. I don't need that negativity in my life. Oh yeah, remember how I mentioned the CDI in the last video? Oh, by the way, if you didn't see that last video, go check it out. Like I said, we're talking about the most catastrophic consoles of all time, which means I've set myself some special requirements that will keep this list from stagnating, unlike most of the consoles that are on this list. So the few criteria that I have for these to meet are, first off, only one company per console. Sorry, Sega. It has to have had a major blow to its company, probably the worst on its record, poor sales figures relative to the company, and middling game sales or a very small library. And of course, just being a really bad console. But keep in mind, not every one of these consoles is going to check off every mark. It just needs at least 2 to be on this list. So without further ado, here is my list of the top 5 most catastrophic consoles of all time. Rearing up the list is the 3DO, first produced in 1993. Originally conceptualized by the founder of EA. Well, calm down guys, we don't hate EA yet at this point. The 3DO was supposed to be the answer to what is going to be the next set of home gaming consoles. And the answer they presented was expensive! Holy shit! You think the PS3 was a wild launch price? This thing retailed for a whopping $699. The price was so high that the individual retailers knocked the price down $100 when they put them up for sale, which actually gave birth to the sales strategy used now of selling consoles at a loss and profiting only on the games. The 3DO received mass attention up to launch, but when it hit the market, people just weren't interested, or they couldn't afford the damn thing. While it was ahead of its time, boasting a never-finished online mode and licensing itself out to third-party developers, it really had nothing to show for it, only releasing a handful of titles and causing a lot of dust to gather on the shelves around them. While the library wasn't all bad, it just didn't have a lot of games, even several years after release. And most of their original IPs did so much better on the competitors' consoles, which were way cheaper. It sold around 2 million consoles over its lifetime, which actually isn't too bad, but with the release of the PS1, the 3DO was put to rest in 1996, a mere 3 years after it came out. The company claimed it as a loss, and to make matters worse, the 3DO went out as a console for shitty porn games. I mean, at least it didn't put the company out, so it didn't fail that bad. Which is more than I can say for the rest of this list. Oh boy, what a sad, unfortunate story this one is. The Sega Saturn, born in 1994 and retailing at $399. Most of you may not remember, but this console was up against the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, an absolute brutal matchup. Most of the failures of this console came from the short-sightedness of Sega. You see, Sega at the time believed that 3D was a gimmick and not the future of gaming, so they mostly stuck with 2D, which had been done to death at this point. Even going so far as to turn down Silicon Graphics 3D chip, which they exclusively offered to Sega. And Sega said, why don't you guys go to Nintendo and pitch this to them? Maybe they'll take it. And you know what? That really sounds familiar. I wonder, oh yeah! This ended up being the same chip that made the Nintendo 64 the monolithic pioneer of the 3D game space. They gave it up. Sega could have been the future, the pioneer of 3D instead of Nintendo, but they just didn't take the gamble. Another blunder by Sega was that to beat PS1 to market, they rushed launch and told retailers, quite literally, the day it was available. Here you go, motherfuckers, console's done! Which seems like a total Chad move. However, no one had any time to advertise or move these units, meaning Saturns were available in the US, but nobody knew. This console is such a tragedy, because around this time, Sega actually stood as a huge obstacle to Nintendo. Competing for a fair share of the market, they were to be the chosen ones, and it all went away due to lack of vision and poor marketing choices. On top of that, remember this gem I talked about? Yeah, this is the only Sonic game made for the Saturn. That's right, just Sonic R. There were others, but this was the only actual game made for the console. Compare that to Nintendo. With their IPs, they would never release a console without having a Mario or Zelda game originally made for that console. Although they sold 9 million units, it didn't stop the fact that the Saturn was a nightmare to develop games for, which caused cancellation after cancellation, which hurt the revenue from the games that they should have gotten. And I mean, the PS1 and the Nintendo were selling a little bit better than the Saturn was. The Saturn should have been the future. It could have been. But it ended up being the biggest blow to Sega's reputation. And I know the Saturn isn't a bad console, but all this mishandling and short-sightedness by Sega is what made this console a failure. And ultimately, it was the cause for Sega even going bankrupt. A lot of people think it was the Dreamcast, but the Saturn is what set the stage for this to happen. Atari, the pioneer of video games. Almost forgot about them, huh? Well, at one point, they were the console market, until they sucked it dry of all the content they could without ever innovating anything. It wasn't until the NES entered the scene to show that games could be good with interesting ideas and not doing the same thing over and over. These events caused Atari to step it up and attempt to take back what was theirs. However, that didn't work out for them that well. Presenting the Atari Jaguar, the latest in Atari's attempts to keep up with the market that was ultimately outgrowing them. The Jaguar, which released in late 1993... Jeez, this was a bad year for consoles. And selling at a reasonable $249.99, the Jaguar started the Bit Wars. Don't know what bits are? Join the club! Every Jaguar advert and commercial boasted about how Jaguar had 64 bits, while the SNES had 16 and the 3DO had 32 bits. But everyone was asking the same question. How is this 64 bits, but most of the games look the same as their lower bit counterparts? Only a few titles were slightly innovating, but even then you could easily see how other consoles brought way more to the table, even with less bits! By the end of 1994, the Jaguar only sold a meager less than 250,000 units, and eventually Atari seemingly gave up on supporting their own console. They secretly started liquidating their stock of Jaguars and immediately dropped out of the console market for good. While it had only 50 games to its name, it was still a relatively good console. And the games were good, but Atari just gave up on this system super quick. We haven't seen a proper console out of Atari since the Jaguar, but they opened the patents for the Jaguar in like 1999 or something, so that means if you want to make a game for the Jaguar and license it, you can just make the game. You can make a game for the Jaguar legally with nothing. And with that being said, people still make games for this thing today. I think the last game someone made for it was in like 2019, and they're actually really good, which just shows that the Jaguar could have been something great, but Atari didn't put enough work into it. If only Atari had found out sooner that if they would fucking try once in a while, maybe they'd get somewhere. But I guess they're just okay with being software developers.
There, you must die!
You knew it was here, so here it is. The CDI, an awful amalgamation of evil, releasing in 1990. Thank God we're out of 93 territory. The CDI was planned to be the next multimedia device of the future. It was supposed to replace your VCR, your CD player, game console, and PC, but as you and I both know, that didn't happen. Philips touted the multimedia system as a good gaming console, which it was not. Aside from the Zelda CDI games, this thing was mostly just on-the-rails shooters with a ton of FMV sequences, so it was more like an interactive movie than an actual video game. The CDI had nothing to boast about game-wise, only releasing 196 titles over its lifetime, with just about every single one being bad. Not many consoles can say that their entire library was trash, but the CDI can for sure brag about that as one of its accomplishments. Another accomplishment it can talk about is how it made Nintendo very untrusting over handing out their IPs. For reasons, this machine retailed at $1,000, an extremely high price for an all-in-one system when you could buy all these things separately for less. This thing promptly dropped out of the console market and was never heard from again until like 20 years later when you started seeing the YouTube poops. The lifetime sales are kind of elusive, but from what I've found is that they sold like less than 500,000 units. But that's not an exact number, and it didn't bankrupt the company, it just made sure they would never touch consoles ever again. And honestly, I think that's a win. I'm sure I'm just beating a dead horse here, but the CDI was a textbook bad video game console. And it had very bad games. And it's number 2 on the list? Huh. So what could top this monstrosity? Okay, let's see here. Poor sales. Yeah, the worst. Small library. Big blow to the company. Well, I mean, it's still lambasted even after 20 years. And bad console? The Virtual Boy. An all-around failure. This console did not have one single thing in its favor. The absolute epitome of a bad console. We have no games, a ridiculous sales price of $179.95, which is almost double what other handheld portable consoles cost, fucking health hazards. I mean, this thing caused headaches, had a risk of creating a lazy eye, and finally, it's the biggest smear on Nintendo's history. The Virtual Boy is and has always been the go-to for Nintendo's worst time. Upon doing research for this list, this bad boy came up everywhere. The Virtual Boy released around late 1995 and was discontinued a mere 1 year later. They just gave it up. It was that bad. Even Big Daddy Nintendo said, "Alright boys, take it out back." Only selling around 700,000 consoles, it is the landmark worst-selling console in history. The health hazards, I mean, wow, this thing had people up in arms over what they had purchased. I mean, imagine playing something that actually causes you pain. It hurt your eyes and your back from how you have to lean in to play the damn thing, making it so you have to take breaks every 10 minutes. They made 22 games, that's it. Just 22 games for this thing. Of all of them, the only ones that were playable were Mario Tennis and Tetris. I'm sorry, Mario's Tennis and Tetris. The 3D Tetris was just Tetris. I mean, thank God they didn't fuck that one up. Even with these two good games, you couldn't even play them for long because your back would start hurting from leaning into the thing, your eyes would start hurting, so you get like 10 minutes out of these games and then you're like, okay, I gotta put this thing away. And the crazy thing is, as bad as this console was, it didn't deter Nintendo even a little bit. They just said, done, we're not gonna mess with that anymore, get it out of here. But it's still a blemish that follows them to this day as one of the greatest video game console failures ever. And for that, f*** you, Virtual Boy. What's weird is you don't see stuff like this today. It was like only in the 90s that you'd see like really bad consoles flop. Nowadays, if a console flops, you don't even hear about it. I mean, do you even know what an Ouya is? So there's just this infamous period of people trying consoles and now everyone's too scared to do it. I'd honestly like to see a new console come out. Something to compete with the big three, but I guess that's asking a lot since they pretty much control the market. Maybe we'll see a change one day, who knows? Man, those were some stinkers, huh? What do you guys think about the list? What stinkers do you think were worse than these stinky boys? Let me know in the comments, and as always, if you like the video, leave a like. If you want to see more, subscribe. Now, if you'll excuse me, watching these old commercials has kind of given me an idea for another video. Bye-bye!